Welcome once again to the podcast of Machine Civilization. I am your host, Clayton Barnett, said transcriber of that future history. I full realize that it's been 2 weeks since my last podcast. There have been some family issues that came up, nothing bad, in fact, good in the short term, probably good in the midterm, and no one can see the future, not even the AIs. There's just too many myriad ways. But all in all, I was entirely too busy to make even a short, coherent podcast. And at one point last week, unless I was recording in the minivan while my wife drove north from South Carolina back to Central Ohio, I was not even in a position to record anything. But here we are all back. And the subject I had picked out, the working title, just like the working title for my next manuscript, which we'll conclude with later, is not something I liked because the working title was Change of Venue. And it's not exactly true. This is more of a change of theme. And this will also, similar to the podcast I gave about writing and copy editing and cover designing, this will be a slightly more technical installment aimed primarily at people who are authors, whether of novels or short stories. Because from personal experience again, and I'll be using my books as examples, is that you've heard all the stories that when I first started writing my first novel, The Fourth Law, that I had no idea what was going on. The characters didn't know what was going on, and I'm sure my initial beta readers had no idea what was going on either. But by the time I got at least halfway through the story, I realized that this was fundamentally just a story about two very close friends, two women who very much loved each other as friends, philia, to use the proper Greek term. In Echoes of Family Lost, which is a sequel to The Fourth Law, I knew as I was getting to the end of that first book that, there was going to be a second one, is I sort of broadened that, but it was still the same. Instead of just looking at two friends, I was now considering two families. And parts of those families had been sundered through space and time. In fact, the protagonist of each family thought the other protagonist was dead. So for the first 2/3 of that book, it's flipping back and forth from these different perspectives. I know, a bad habit of mine, I'm aware. It's much better now, though. Until just after midway in the book, about 60% through, is that these two groups bump into one another. And then there's attempted reconciliation, bottom drops out, everything goes to shit, final reconciliation, and it's all a big, happy, warm, fuzzy ending. Because, hey, I'm just a softy old middle-aged man, and I love me a happy ending. The next book is I realized I did not want to get stuck in a rut. I did not want to get stuck in a rut with the human characters, with the machine characters, or even with a story type. Because I guess if you're first talking about the love between friends and then the love between families, I said, okay, well, let's do something with romantic love. And as you've heard me mention before, by my college degree and initial career, I'm an engineer. So the last person who would know anything about romantic and sexual love, of course, would be somebody like me. Still, I'm a writer, which means I'm paid to lie. So I came up with, well, I'm going to write a romance story. I really didn't know the details yet. I knew it would be situated somewhere in the future history of machine civilization. And then after taking some notes, I said, okay, well, there's going to be a synth, Christopher, and his by-law cousin, Katarina, but considering that he is not, his body is human, but it was recovered from a dead late-teen male who had a symbiotic quantum core brain stuck into a skull cavity, that no, there's no blood relationship there at all. And even early on in that, I said, why just make it a simple romance story? Because to be perfectly honest, unless it's a musical, that's going to be pretty boring. And even if it's a musical, you're going to need some sort of opposition. Now, there is, of course, opposition in the background of the entire collapse of the U.S. economy and then the collapse of the United States political system. So there's that, but you need something tactical right up there that will potentially destroy this wonderful budding relationship between these two kids. So I introduced Christopher's also, quote-unquote, sister. She was made just as he was, but whereas he is passively demonically possessed, again, spoilers, and if you want to know all the details, please go buy the book, Cursed Hearts. Hers is much more open and much more overt, and she takes pleasure in killing people, and the only person she feels remotely attached to is her brother who just left her alone at this experimental facility, which basically tortured both of them into what they are in Hokkaido, and he left for UC San Diego, and of course immediately fell in love with his cousin, so he's got everything going for him, and she wants him back. So I introduced horror elements into a book that I wanted to be a romance. So here are two things I'm not really familiar with, especially I don't think I've ever bought a book on horror. My wife has a scad of Stephen King novels. I've read a couple of his short stories and didn't think they were too bad, but I've never gotten more than maybe 2 pages into one of his novels because it's just not something that interests me. Again, my life is too short and sucks in too many ways already. Why would I want to be more miserable? Having finished Cursed Hearts, my next thought was, okay, how about a police procedural? Because at that time, my wife and I were watching a couple of shows from England, such as Life on Mars. And, okay, I've never done that before. I know almost nothing about the subject. I don't watch police shows on TV. And again, I've never really read the genre, but I wanted to push myself and I wanted to do something different. Took a lot of notes and very quickly realized that I was still too young a writer to attempt to pull something like this off. In fact, it was about 4 months later that I was giving a talk at a local anime convention at Zuricon in Columbus, Ohio, about creative writing and self-publishing. And afterwards, a guy stuck around and said he was U.S. Army military policeman, was his primary MOS. And he said, have you ever tried doing one of those corkboard things with you put the picture up and you draw the interconnections between? And I said, no, because I don't have any frame of reference to do that. But I took a lot of notes and still came flat up against the wall that no, I did not know what I was doing. And as much as I liked where that story was going, I simply couldn't. I did not have the experience to do it. Looking around at that point, still wanting to do something different, I said, let's go completely out of left field and make a children's early reader. So the dialogue and the text was pretty simple because you're looking at maybe 4 or 5 words on each page. The trick was to find an illustrator who could draw this Christian story about a young girl who wants to be baptized, and we meet this little girl's family, Henge, and it just turns out her family are all the main characters from Tribe Tosca of the Machines, of Machine Civilization. Yes, I'm actually that big of a sneaky asshole that I want young children in kindergarten and first grade introduced to my characters so that when they're in late primary school and middle school and high school, they say, oh, I remember this story about that girl way back when, and oh, it's the same family and it's the same setting. I want lifelong readers. I want to catch them when they're young and have them hooked and have them stay on that hook and have them sending me money for the rest of their lives. And hopefully they pass on the books to their children too. Anyway, back to the point. The important thing for a children's early reader, of course, is illustrations. So I did much internet searching until I finally found Claudia Gadati, who lives on, I assume, I haven't talked to her in years, North Island, New Zealand. Again, the great fantastic power of the internet is you can scour the world for talent. And she took my horrible stick figure sketches and terrible descriptions and turned them into some absolutely beautiful art. And then I, at that point, using Adobe Acrobat, because before that I'd been simply using Microsoft Word, and Word does not manipulate pictures well at all. So I was able to put everything together and get that commercially released, and it's called Henge's Big Day. At that point, I said, okay, we're on a roll. We need to have another story. And I thought back to the end of Echoes of Family Lost, the story that was about two families. And I said, what happens, say, half a generation later? Because in that story, there's a little 3-year-old boy, Gary, and also almost in the last chapter, we find out that Gary's mother is expecting his sister. So I said, okay, what became of these kids? And so I learned a little bit more about Gary Hartman when he was turning 13, living and growing up in Knoxville, former Tennessee. And I also met his very brash, arrogant, then 9, later 10-year-old sister, Faustina. And what was their story? What were they trying to tell me? And it was a 2-part book called Worlds Without End, which has also been called the most Catholic of my books. I guess because, again, I don't get preachy, as you've heard me say in my podcast about religion. But we do see Gary praying. We see Faustina praying, them praying together, them and their mother going to church. Their father is nominally Christian, but he really is not a believer in any stretch of the imagination. So that story of Worlds Without End is broken into 2 parts. The first part being about their friend Tracy, who has also been modified, her nervous system modified by the machines, just as Gary and his sister have. But she's a broken individual. Her mind has gone away into the void and never quite made it back. And that provoked a response from her older brother in a desire of vengeance against the machines. And the first part of World Without End is, how does that play out? As a result of the very last scene of part 1, Gary's girlfriend, Henge, who is a AI machine, gets an idea in her little mechanical head about what she can do to manifest a physical body for the boy she loves so much, to live with him for the rest of her now natural life. And so the second half of Worlds Without End deals with her and her family coming to terms with her desire to quite literally turn her back on immortality. Because outside of a complete collapse of all electronic systems everywhere on the Earth-Moon system, the machines are always going to survive somewhere. They're not effectively immortal, but they're a hell of a lot more immortal than humans are, and she wants to walk away from that just to be in the physical world with the man she loves. So that's the second half of that book. Following that, I said, okay, let's see if I can put it all together. Again, changing frame, changing theme. So I began what is now called Friend and Ally, about Cole 5 Clark. This time, not an AI or a human, but an actual android, standalone self-aware android, made in Sony Corporation, Osaka, Japan, who is dispatched to Portland, former Oregon, one of the last functioning ports on the west coast of the United States, former United States. And this is where I'm trying to pull all of these things I've taught myself together. So there's friendship, there's family conflict, there's romance, there's politics, and there's war and combat, something I'd not really written about up until then. So as I'm gathering all that together, I realize, this is going to be another one with a sequel. So the sequel is Foes and Rivals. This is also some more combat, but it's a lot more politics. It is Nicole 5 insinuating herself into the system that the quote-unquote mayor of Portland, he's dictator in all but name, has created for himself, and her relationship with the mayor's daughter, who she is trying to set up as his replacement in creating a monarchical system. And, of course, in a previous podcast, you know how I go on and on about monarchy. So this was really my big exposure to writing about politics, to writing about espionage, because not just between Nicole and the mayor's daughter, Nicole also ends up using her very mousy friend across the hall from her dorm as a double agent in the city government. And Nicole at one point says, I'm a terrible person. I'm using up a human being. Have I fallen that far? But from the point of view of this podcast, and the dogs are barking again upstairs, good boys, is